Thank you so much for the warm introduction. I'm really excited to be presenting my work today. And so today my presentation is titled Examining the Role of Hope in PrEP willingness, adherence, and persistence among young African women. This work is part of my fellowship with the HIV Prevention Trial Network Scholar Program. And my mentor through that program is Dr. Connie Kellum at the University of Washington. And so, as you all know, about 1 in 4 new HIV diagnoses in sub-Saharan Africa occur among adolescent girls and young women in the 15 to 24 age group. You find that young women in this demographic have over 6 times the HIV risk compared to their male counterparts in Southern Africa, and about 3 times the HIV risk compared to young men in Eastern Africa. Due to this high incidence in this population, young women have been a priority population for the rollout of biomedical HIV prevention strategies. So in the early rollout with oral PrEP, we found that young women had challenges in adherence and persistence. In the POWER study, we found just about half of young women were adhering at the first month and even fewer at the 3-month time point. And we saw similar trends in the 3P study. Due to sort of this suboptimal adherence and persistence in this population, there has been a great need to understand what are some of the things that we can do to improve PrEP adherence in this population. And so one of the factors, it was sort of from this work that I have a growing interest in sort of this concept of hope. And so hope is a positive future expectancy. It has been found that being more hopeful is associated with adherence to medication across a variety of conditions. Specifically in the world of HIV research, we have found that hope is associated with ART adherence and quality of life among people who are living with HIV. There's been less research understanding the relationship between hope and HIV prevention. If you look at this diagram here, you see that we hypothesize that when you're in a high HIV risk environment, where there is a high prevalence of HIV in your region and you have lower levels of hope, there may be a reduced capacity for engagement in HIV prevention. And so based on this work, I was really interested in understanding how this relationship holds, especially for young women. The objectives of my study were to examine the relationship between PrEP willingness, adherence, and persistence among young women. I conducted this research in the context of HPTN 082. 082 was a phase 4 randomized multi-site prospective study to assess PrEP acceptance and adherence among young HIV uninfected women. Approximately 451 young women were enrolled in the study in Zimbabwe and two cities within South Africa. Young women were randomized into one of two arms. The first was an enhanced adherence arm where they received counseling and observed drug levels, and there's a standard of care arm. The main outcomes from this study were that about 95% of participants ended up taking PrEP, but we found that confirmed detectable PrEP at month decreased over time. And so we saw high detectable PrEP at the first month, but this slowly reduced. There was also 4 seroconversions in the study. So to understand the relationship between hope and across these three aims, I used a measure called the Hope for the Future scale that I will be showing you in just a moment. I used, for the first aim, I looked at PrEP willingness, which is 7 items from a larger HIV prevention readiness scale. For adherence, I used DBS levels, and I used a cutoff of 700 FML per punch. And for PrEP persistence, I used an outcome of detectable PrEP at the 6th and 9th month. For my analyses, for the first aim, I used linear regression to understand baseline hope and PrEP willingness. For the second aim, I used GEE to examine baseline PrEP and then adherence across the three time points. And then for the final aim, I used logistic regression to understand the association between hope and PrEP persistence at these 2 time points. These are the items from the Hope for the Future scale. And so they're broadly under these 3 domains of a personal motivation to achieve goals, an anticipation of a positive future, as well as the influence of others on hope, and whether you have supportive people in your life who are have hope in your success and future. So now I'll get into some of the results from my work. Here's a brief profile of my study population. And so the median age was 21. Most participants had a secondary education or higher, and they were evenly split across the 3 study sites. We found overall that participants had a high level of hope. So the hope scale went from 6 to 24, and you see that the mean was 21 and the median was 22, indicating very high levels of hope. For the PrEP willingness scale, the range was 6 to 30, and again, we see a high level of willingness. We found that that there was a positive association between now baseline hope and PrEP willingness. And so a unit increase in hope was associated with a 0.26 increase in PrEP willingness. So now when we started looking at adherence, we did not find a significant association between hope and high PrEP adherence at follow-up. And similarly, we did not find a relationship between hope and PrEP persistence at 6 months or at 9 months. And so in conclusion, we found that hope was associated with PrEP willingness, but not adherence or persistence. And so it's possible that incorporating hope may be important for sort of raising young women's willingness to use PrEP, increasing awareness of PrEP, and sort of, and we see hope as something that can be filled through structural interventions, educational interventions that sort of build future goals and aspirations for young people. However, we did not find that association between adherence and persistence. So there is further research maybe to disentangle what those relationships are between hope. And also, since we saw such a high level of hope in our population, there might be more further work to refine measures to understand sort of what are the complexities of this measure, over this construct. And so thank you so much. I just want to thank the HIV Prevention Trial Network for this being part of the Scholar program and all the funding that went into the program and into the research. And thank you so much. I look forward to your questions later on.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Kashani. This is really interesting. I think we have time for one question maybe, and then if others want to put their questions in the chat, and maybe Waru can respond to them later in the hour. Does anyone have a question? You can just jump on to Zoom. Monica's got her hand up, so I suppose we'll let her ask one. Monica.
Well, I just thank you so much, Waru. I thought that was incredibly unique. I don't think I've ever thought about the aspect of hope as a predictor for uptake of anything, actually. But it would really make sense, like, for example, in terms of treatment. And
Mhm.
so it would be great if you could extend and maybe do some work in treatment, because that is really a place where there's like an absolute manifestation of HIV treatment outcomes is taking the medication. And I think it's so complicated in PrEP, all the
Mhm.
reasons why we would take PrEP, but I would encourage to use same objective adherence metrics, same really innovative scale, but look at a treated population.
Yeah, thank you for that. I
I know
totally,
this is HPTN and all that, but yeah,
yeah.
it's prevention.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that's really important. I sort of struggled in working on the manuscript now is sort of like, why wasn't there a relationship, right? And I
Yeah.
think you have to, sort of think about this population and why potentially something, some like adherence for oral PrEP has been traditionally really difficult for this population. But you did see so in some of the work I did in the background for this, there has been associations between PrEP and contraceptive use, right? And so there's something about potentially that HIV prevention might be a little bit harder to, daily oral PrEP might be a little bit harder for a construct like this. So I definitely think thinking about it on the treatment aspect would be really important.
Great. And it looks like Kate Koss has a question, a multi-part question in the chat, but I think for the sake of moving us along, I want to transition to the next part. But Waru, if you can, after you get your breath after your next part, if you can respond to Kate in the chat, that'd be great. I think it's an interesting set of questions. But so I will turn it back to you to introduce our next speaker.
Right. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Sybil Hosek. She's a research professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of Illinois, Chicago. She's a clinical psychologist by training with over 20 years of experience in development and implementation of HIV-related research studies and behavioral interventions. She's co-PI of the NICHD-funded Adolescent Trials Network for HIV interventions, as well as protocol chair for HPTN 08301 and 08401, which assess safety, tolerability, and acceptability of long-acting CAB for the prevention of HIV among adolescent males and females. Her research focuses on primary prevention interventions for adolescent young adults, including PrEP and microbicides, and the development of behavioral interventions to improve uptake, adherence, and persistence to these new biomedical strategies. In addition to her independent NIH grants focused on adolescents and young adults, gay, bisexual, and trans young people in the US, Sybil also has been an investigator on a number of studies with young people in Eastern and Southern Africa. I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Hosek through the HPTN network. The data I presented earlier from 082 was a study for which she was on the protocol team and did a lot of the work shaping the social and behavioral science perspective. And so we're really excited to have her presenting with her today.
Thank you, Waru, and great presentation. And I think the questions afterwards will be really helpful. I'll present some data from 082, which I think will also give us a little bit more insight into the population and some of the other things that might be going on. So let me go ahead and share my screen. So thank you, everyone, for allowing me to speak today and for letting me reschedule from last week due to a COVID blip. When Mallory and Monica asked me to come and talk, and I said, what am I supposed to talk about? Is this kind of like a scoping review of something? And Monica said, no, just talk about your own work. So I thought, oh, that's fun. We'll, sort of take a trip down memory lane, and seeing so many names and faces on this call today, I think you'll be taking a trip down that lane with me because so many of you have done this work with me. So it's great to see so many familiar faces and names. This is just kind of an overview of what I'm going to try to talk about. And at the end, I will, if we have time, touch on some of the studies that we're hoping to launch within the ATN coming up soon. So I chose to focus on adherence of all the things that I could pull from our studies, and Waru's presentation is a great example of that work. But the reason I chose adherence is because clearly it's one of the greatest challenges that we have in the medical field. There's umpteen preventable deaths and billions of dollars that could be saved if we were able to in some way tackle non-adherence. And non-adherence is, an issue that's sort of developmentally associated with adolescents who are really 4 times less adherent than their adult counterparts, depending on what the disease state or chronic illness might be. But adolescents really tend to hover around 50% adherence. I did not do that. I don't know if somebody else did that. There. No? Okay. Something's happening to my slides. Okay. So there's, a lot that we know about adherence and the factors about non-adherence and the things that influence adherence, particularly among chronically ill populations. And this is actually a model that Claude Mellons shared at CROI a couple of years ago, which is just really, expansive. Like, when Waru talks about why not hope, well, there's so many other things going on with young people. And so we know a lot of this already. But when we first started talking about PrEP, we weren't thinking about chronic illness, right? We weren't thinking about medication non-adherence per se. And so actually the very first PrEP study that we did was ATN-082, and we launched that in 2009. So this is prior to IPREX results. This is prior to any of the adult efficacy data becoming clear. And at that point, we weren't really thinking about adherence. Everybody was concerned about sex and adolescents having sex and, God forbid, having too much sex. And so really what we were trying to look at was, if we put PrEP into the mix, and at that time we didn't know whether PrEP was efficacious or not, but how would that influence sexual behavior and sexual risk behavior? And can we combine this with behavioral interventions to try to ameliorate any of those effects? So we had a study that had 3 arms. One was taking tenofovir, basically Truvada. The other was a placebo, and then we had a no pill arm, and everybody got a behavioral intervention. So everything was a combined intervention. And that was really our focus, was sort of the acceptability and feasibility of that strategy. At that time, we did not have really a good understanding of what to measure in terms of adherence, thinking about Monica's comment and Kate's on the line as well. And so all we did was look for detectable tenofovir. Was it there or was it not? So the data that came out of it may be heavily influenced by white coat dosing. We don't know. But it did start to show this distinction between what young people were reporting, self-reporting in terms of their pill taking, and perhaps what was actually happening. This again is just yes or no plasma tenofovir detection or not. But when these data were presented, I remember the late great Don Smith, approached me at CROI and said, what happened? Well, what happened was, these are young people, and young people don't like to take medication. And this is a preventative medication at that. And so we kind of realized, well, obviously we need to do a lot more. Let me just remind everybody of sort of the PrEP science timeline. 082 launched in 2009. And the IPREX results came out just approximately a year later. And then the 082 cohort was allowed to be included into the IPREX open label extension, which really started to get young people under the age of 18 into these studies, or under the age of 20, really 21. And then we had sort of this roller coaster, right, of results. We had positive findings from Partners PrEP and TDF2. We had negative findings from FemPrep and Voice. But over that time, we were able to get an indication for oral PrEP in those 18 and above. We realized, obviously, that our goal is to have access to PrEP simultaneously with adults. And so what did we need to do to make that happen? Well, we designed ATN 110 and 113. And these were 2 parallel studies. 110 was focused on 18 to 22-year-olds. 113 was focused on 15 to 17-year-olds. We intentionally split them with the hope of making sure that anything regulatory and ethics associated with 113 would not interfere with the launch of 110. But these studies were more traditional kind of safety bridging studies, and they really were meant to collect the regulatory data necessary to get the adolescent indication, because at this point we were lacking that indication. So looking at the safety data, Kathy Mulligan led a sub-study looking at bone and metabolic data. We looked at acceptability and adherence and patterns of use and all of the things that some of the adult trials had already started to incorporate. We took from the IPREX study and the IPREX-Olay, we took their schema. And so that basically entailed follow-up monthly at the beginning and then spreading out to quarterly over a year. And so you can see the follow-up visits. And the reason I'm highlighting that is because there's really a distinct drop-off, as you'll start to see with adolescent studies in those later months. But obviously from OA2, we knew what we needed to introduce some kind of adherence intervention. And so our first stab at that was partnering with Revea Miko and her integrated next step counseling model. And this was also, again, being used in the IPREX-Olay studies. It was the first time really that it had been used with adolescents per se. But this was really a conversation that was happening at all of the study visits around sexual health promotion and strategies to promote sexual health, and then tying PrEP use and PrEP adherence into those discussions. And our feedback from 110 and 113 was that the youth really, really liked this counseling environment. They liked the flexibility that they found to be able to discuss different things. And honestly, it was the first time that many of them were having conversations with adults about sexual health. And so they really appreciated that. Now, this is just to show you that we had a very diverse sample, and actually more diverse than some of the US PrEP studies at that time. So that was really important given the geography and demographics of the HIV epidemic. But you can see here that did the counseling really translate into sustained adherence? And the answer is probably not. So in those first monthly visits, week 4, week 8, week 12, we actually saw really good adherence. The 700 and above marker equates to four or more doses a week. And we know that that is really highly, highly protective in the PrEP world. And so then we also see, that there are some missed doses below that, but most people are trying and most people are taking medication, and there's very few missed visits. When we started to go to quarterly visits, you see a dramatic increase, not only in those that are just not taking it at all, but also in the missed visits. And we heard this from the youth. We heard them say, we sort of lost track of the study, or we forgot about it, or, life got in the way, and we didn't see you and we didn't hear from you, and we missed you, but we forgot about taking our pill and we forgot about coming to the visits. So that becomes kind of an important theme throughout the rest of our studies, is what do we do to maintain that engagement and retention over time? There really wasn't difference between the adherence levels of the 18 to 22-year-olds and the 15 to 17-year-olds. I mean, it's much, much poorer in the teenagers, but it's still not good in those that were above the age of 18. So this data was taken into consideration by the FDA when they reviewed it for licensure, and actually put into the label that adolescents could benefit from more frequent visits and counseling. And I think this is really important because we often forget this, and we go back to kind of at baseline, what's scalable and what's feasible, and try to equate that with what we're doing with adults. And that's not really what's needed. In my mind, what this data shows you with this is that standard of care is more than for adolescents. It's more than what we're doing for adults. And that just has to be. So moving forward, we were approached by our good friends, and I see Jonathan on the line. I'm not sure if Al is on, from UCSF and San Francisco Department of Public Health, to look at how can we integrate then technology, which most young people love, into this PrEP landscape, and how do we use, for example, SMS support reminders to help get people going on PrEP. And so they introduced us to PrEPmate. And PrEPmate was a web-based platform that incorporated videos and information and forums online, but also at the beginning, a daily text message. It's kind of a fun little fact, a fun little PrEP fact, with a little note to remember to take your PrEP. But then also these weekly check-ins that were modeled after some of Lester's work in Africa with those living with HIV. And so the idea is, how is it going? And this was all automated, but participants loved that they felt like somebody was checking in on them. Somebody was paying attention to them over time. So this really showed us that this kind of little bit of adherence support went a long way. And the results were really striking, and we had really good adherence even when we went to quarterly visits. You can see overall that the majority of folks were taking pills in the protective range across the entire study. Although missed visits, as we saw in 110 and 113, did increase over time. So that's kind of the persistence issue. By intervention arm, we did see that there was a statistically significant impact of this intervention, this fairly easy to implement intervention over time. And in fact, the CDC evaluated this intervention and has considered it as one of the evidence-based interventions and best practices for PrEP care. So again, standard of care is not nothing. Standard of care plus is what we have to be thinking about for youth. So Waru did a beautiful job of explaining HPTN 082, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but this is again taking then what we had learned with these adolescent trials here in the US and how does that apply to the sub-Saharan Africa context and what can we bring to young people. And this again is on the heels of failures in several large trials, PrEP trials on the continent, looking at both microbicides and oral PrEP for cisgender women. So that idea of standard of care, what is standard of care? We decided that standard of care for this intervention needed to be inclusive of SMS texting, inclusive of some kind of counseling. And then we also added adherence clubs. And adherence clubs were group gatherings, in-person group gatherings. Sorry, I didn't do that. In-person group gatherings that brought people together to talk about PrEP, but also just to talk about life skills and things like that. And then we wanted to find out if we added drug level feedback counseling at the different visits. So this sort of biofeedback of, how well you're actually doing with taking your PrEP. Are you in the protective area or not? To see if that made a difference in terms of the adherence components for young women. So just back to thinking about what Waru presented, I think a couple of things that stick out to me just in the demographics of who we enrolled in this study and what we see consistently across adolescent trials in several of the sub-Saharan African settings is A, the level of depressive symptoms and the level of intimate partner violence and exposure to other kinds of violence. And those are two factors, if you think back to one of the first slides that I showed that Claude Ann developed, these are factors that we know influence adherence. And so these are happening in the background of any intervention that we're doing with this population. And it's something that absolutely needs to be kept in mind. So we designed a counseling intervention that was really built on cognitive behavioral therapy and problem-solving therapy. There were some elements of empowerment work around kind of gender-focused theory. And we drew activities from several of the youth-focused interventions that we had designed in the ATN, but mostly for women living with HIV or adolescents and young adults living with HIV. And those were ACCEPT and Evolution. And these were manualized interventions. They were very structured. Participants came in, the counselors were trained in how to deliver the intervention. We assessed for fidelity. We were monitoring and supervising the counselors. And so they had several different areas that they wanted to talk to the participants about, PrEP just being one of them, but also trying to get at kind of gender dynamics and reproductive decision-making, problem solving, and stress, things like that we thought would be useful for the young women. And in general, the counseling was appreciated and the young women enjoyed the interactions that they had with the counselors. But one thing that we did hear qualitatively was that they wished that they could decide what they wanted to talk about and that it didn't have to be so structured. So I think that's a really important piece of feedback that we took away from this study. This just gives you an idea of the messaging that we were giving with the drug level feedback. We were telling people, in the highest categories that they were doing great, basically keep up the good work, that for those who were taking it, but that were missing a few pills, like what can we help you do do better? And then for those that weren't taking the pills at all, is this really something that you're still interested in? And if it is, then how can we help you improve? And while Waru's results were also negative, so were the overall study. And so what we found was, even though, you know, there were high levels of detectable tenofovir in the early months, really those with high levels of protection were very few, and dropped off, you know, tremendously over the course of the study. And we did not see any difference between those who received the drug level feedback and those that did not. But again, we did find that those who did not have depression, who did not have issues with disclosure, and who did attend the adherence clubs were more likely to be high adherers or to be in that high adherer category. And at the same time that, and I know I'm flying through these, but I'm hoping for time for questions at the end. At the same time that 082 was wrapping up, we were designing the REACH study. And the REACH study was looking at the dapivirine ring and oral PrEP among adolescent cisgender women in Africa between the ages of 16 and 21. And this is because in the large phase 3 dapivirine ring studies, they found no efficacy in this age group, and again, largely due to non-adherence. And so I remember when Sharon Hillier approached me to see if I wanted to join this protocol team, and my first question was like, are you gonna tell us that we have to scale back the interventions, or am I going to be really limited? Because as a social and behavioral scientist, that's something that happens a lot. You know, we say like, this is really important to do, and then we're told, we'll scale that back quite a bit. You know, that's not realistic. We can't do that. It's not important. And Sharon said, you can do whatever you want, whatever you want to do. And so that was it for me. That was great. Because what I wanted to do was give participants choice and options. And so what we did is we designed this adherence support menu. And at every visit, we said to them, these are all the things that we've thought of that you might want to do, or maybe you have a better idea of something that we can help you with. And let's review these every time you come in and see how those are working. And if there's something else that you would like us to put in place to help you remember to use the ring or to take your oral PrEP pill. And we also incorporated drug level feedback into those conversations, not so much to say like, this is the level that you're at, but, you know, this is what happened last month. Does this mean then that maybe you need more or less intervention? And do you think that intervention should be in person or more digital, et cetera? And so we really gave people choice, which was really important in this study, because the way it was designed was that each participant was having 6 months on oral PrEP, 6 months on the dapivirine ring, and then they were going to go into a period of choice. So we wanted people to try both products, and we wanted them to try different adherence support options to see what worked best for them. And we were actually really thrilled with the results. These are some of the best adherence results that we've seen in adolescent studies for both the dapivirine ring and oral PrEP. We found, again, higher than anticipated adherence. Fewer than 5% of the visits overall were categorized as no or low adherence to study product. And I want to say too, which I don't think I said at the beginning, these were monthly visits. And this is really a passion of mine about seeing people frequently or having contact with people frequently. So these were monthly visits over an 18-month period. So this was no small task for these youth. And they loved their counselors. They loved coming to the clinics. Sure, it got taxing sometimes, and not everybody was a fan of coming in every month. But overall, I think you see a difference. In terms of the strategies that they chose for adherence counseling or from that adherence menu, they varied. People did fluctuate in what they wanted, and they fluctuated also by geography. And so what somebody in Johannesburg or Cape Town wanted was very different than what somebody in Uganda or Zimbabwe wanted. And so I think that again reminds us that choice is going to be really important when we're thinking about what options are available to support adherence, and that perhaps, you know, a very kind of rigid manualized intervention, which is how we thought of adherence at the beginning, is not the right option, because it's not allowing people the flexibility to talk about what they want to talk about and to be able to be supported in the ways that they want to be supported. I think interesting also from this study is the fact that by gaining mastery of adherence, particularly around oral prep. So those that were consistently getting strong results in their drug level feedback were more likely to choose oral prep. So they felt really confident that they could do it. And that was demonstrated to them in the initial phases. And so they chose oral prep in the choice phase. But overall, most participants, 2/3, chose the ring ultimately in the choice period. So the last study that I want to talk about is the HPTN 083 and 08401. And these were the registrational trials for cabotegravir long-acting in adolescents below the age of 18. There were two, we called them the twins. HPTN 08301 was focused on young men and trans women here in the US, and 08401 was focused on cisgender young women in sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm really just going to focus on 08401 because we don't have the final results for 08301 yet. And 08401 we presented at CROI this year. But these, again, very similar to ATN 110 and 113, are really traditional safety and bridging studies to make sure that we have the regulatory data needed for licensure. And in this case, we wanted simultaneous licensure for adolescents and adults, and we were able to achieve that. This just gives you an example of some of the demographics that we collected. And again, similarly, this is a much younger sample than the ATN 08 or than the HPTN 082 sample, but still high rates of depressive symptomatology, transactional sex, and other risk behaviors. So I think it's really important to see that even in a population with a mean age of 16. So adherence, our desire to have long-acting products is largely driven by the adherence advantage that those products bring. And for this study, there was an oral lead-in. And so it's interesting, I think you could even see in those first 4 weeks, this was a 4-week period of time of a daily pill, participants did very well, but you still start to see that the folks who are taking it 100% of the time starts to decrease. And those taking it less than the 75% of time needed to move into the injection phase starts to increase. And so even within that small window, there's challenges. When you look, though, at the injection adherence, it's outstanding, right? It's close to 100% all the time. There were a couple of late injections and a couple that were missed because they were pregnant and were put back on oral TDF. So this is, it's amazing. But this was a short study, it's 6 months. Most of these participants have now transitioned into HPTN 084, the open label extension, and then we'll move into the access protocol if they continue to desire to be on cabotegravir. And so we'll see, we'll have to see over time how retention continues, particularly now that participants are in a period of choice where they're deciding that this is a product that they want and that they like. 92% of our participants at the end, when they were given a choice whether they wanted to stay on CAB or whether they wanted to transition over to oral product, continued to stay with CAB. So I think that's really promising. And there is promise with long-acting agents, but they're not a silver bullet. We can't assume that this is the answer for everybody. We do know, if we compare it, for example, with contraception, that long-acting products have higher continuation rates, fewer barriers to obviously adherence, but also to uptake. And there are several additional long-acting products that are being studied or are currently available. We do have the monthly Depivirine ring. There are formulations that are looking at longer acting rings, perhaps over 3 months. There was a monthly tablet that was being studied. For Merck, that was taken off the table, but my understanding is that there's some movement to get a different formulation back into the research pipeline. Obviously, we now have injectable cabotegravir across multiple studies and all ages, which is fantastic. And Gilead is currently studying their long-acting lenacapavir product, which is a subcutaneous injection every 6 months. And that study, those large phase 3 studies are including adolescents ages 16 to 17. So again, hopefully there will be adequate data to be able to get a regulatory approval should that turn out to be efficacious. But again, like I said, not a silver bullet. We still have to come to visits. Young people still have to make time in their lives for those things. There's a lot of structural barriers for laboratory monitoring, clinic-based visits, et cetera, that we're going to have to overcome. And we have to overcome these things because in the United States, for example, we are not meeting any of our PrEP targets for any of our ages. But clearly adolescents are those who are benefiting from PrEP the least. And so we have to figure out a way to do much more. So, moving onward, and then I'm just going to talk about a couple of implementation studies that we're doing in the ATN. I think we have to continue to test these different behavioral interventions to support and improve biomedical products. There are many factors that influence adherence. There are structural factors, there are interpersonal factors, there are community level factors, and all of those things need to be investigated. How can we intervene to help improve the prevention product efficacy and effectiveness? I love the idea of products that sort of have an adherence advantage, and that puts that burden on the product developer, come up with a better product. This is not the patient's fault, but I think, again, we don't have a silver bullet at this point for what's going to be the most, reach the most young people in different locations, different geographies, different demographics, et cetera. So we definitely need implementation studies. We need implementation science to help us figure out how to roll these products out and with what level of support and need. And we need clinical trials of behavioral interventions to support these products and to see how we can do that. And so, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't put in a plug for a couple of the ATN studies that we are launching in the new Adolescent Medicine Trials Network, trying to get at some of these things. Adherence to ART, both for prevention and treatment, is one of the pillars and priority areas that we are focused on within the ATN. One of the studies that I want to highlight is our LIPS study, which is linking youth to PrEP services. This is ATN 165. And this study is really looking at getting PrEP out of the clinics and getting it into the communities. And so we're looking at home-based or community-based delivery of all of the PrEP products and trying to figure out how that is, is that feasible? Is it manageable? How do we support young people to get PrEP where they want it and not having to find clinics, which, many youth don't go to in the first place. So that is LIPS. There's also Choose, which is really building off of EPIC. Actually, it's taking a package of mobile health tools, PrEPmate being one of those tools, and looking at how that influences PrEP uptake and adherence and persistence across time. Also incorporating DoxyPEP into that model to see how youth take DoxyPrep as directed and or as when it's recommended. And then to look at some of the structural barriers associated either with ART adherence for those living with HIV or for PrEP adherence and uptake for those not living with HIV. We have the LEAP study, which is ATN 167, really looking at the legal, economic, and peer support needed for trans youth, particularly trans youth of color in the United States. And so this is establishing medical legal partnerships, implementing microeconomic strategies, so with payments for young people to be able to get through and make ends meet, and how does that help with their prevention health and sexual and reproductive health, and then gender affirming peer support as well. And then I have like 2 minutes left just to announce, just because of the team that's on here, to please spread the word that the ATN Scholars Program is opening. Just wanted to let folks know, and Waru is a wonderful example of the HPTN Scholars Program for those who are particularly interested in adolescent research, domestic adolescent research. We are looking for early stage investigators and junior scientists to be able to use existing ATN data from past iterations of ATN to join protocol teams that are currently in the new ATN, and it's structured much like other scholars programs. But our applications are now open and due at the end of November. Audrey Pettifor is leading our scholars program, and there's an email there as well as the webpage, which can give more information about that. And so hopefully we did that in time. I know that was a lot of information, and fast and furious coming at you, but that way we have time to chat.
That was awesome, Sybil. And I'm going to jump in with a question about the ATN Scholars Program. So it looks similar in the resources and the scope and duration as HPTN Scholars. Is it, I can't remember what the eligibility criteria in terms of what stage, like, is it early stage investigators? Is it, where
We're starting
in
off,
the-
we're starting off this time with early stage investigators. I mean, junior investigators. I don't think we're being particular about what they have or haven't done yet. We actually had a really good conversation at the network meeting about in future iterations, and we will continue to do this every year, bringing in people earlier in their careers, because there's a lot of sense of like, how do we build the workforce? Do we have to wait for people to have their terminal degree before they start to learn how to do this research from a public health perspective? So I imagine that in future iterations, we will have folks who maybe have their MPH, maybe are still in their doctoral program, or even community folks who really want to get into graduate school, but need some scholarly work to be able to do that. Thank you, Lauren. I appreciate that. So we really want to be, I think, creative about who we bring in and start that pipeline of researchers much earlier on.
Great. So I sort of preempted the Q&A, but let's open it up for questions or comments for Dr. Hosek.
And just to say, Mallory, I know you do so much work with scholars programs across you wear many different hats. So please pass the word. We're wanting to collaborate with any other scholar programs that are available as well. And so, please just let us know.
Absolutely. We got a few mailing lists. This is perfect for us. So we will spread the word.
Thank you.
And Monica, did I see your hand up? I couldn't tell. Yep.
Yeah, that was great. So, well, thank you so much. I actually have two questions. One is it's so important that the data that you showed about the defibrillating vaginal ring acceptance, like in the real world, the defibrillating vaginal ring looks so good, like compared to, the Aspire studies, like it just keeps on getting better and better in rollout. What do you think is the chances of the FDA approving the ring? Because we have it in Europe and we have it in WHO and we don't have it here. And then my second question is that I thought that Jeannie Marazzo's presentation at CROI 2023 about the 4 doses a week, like that's what women need, right? Like women aren't different than men. Like they just need it around the time that it's kind of an on demand, like you need it around the time you're having sex. Can we formally codify and get away from this element that women need more adherence than men, that women need 7 doses a week and men need 4? That really bothers me because it's being played out right now in the doxy question.
Yes. No, I appreciate that, Monica. So first around the defibrillating ring, and every time I present to an audience, to a domestic audience, it's so discouraging because people say, why aren't we having that? Why don't we have access to that?
Right?
It's terrible. And my understanding is that the application was pulled from the FDA. So I don't know what they would even work from, to be able to consider the indication. And it's sad because I think that the more that we see that young women want it and that they're going to use it, right? I mean, you might have, you have a PrEP pill that, maybe 99.9999% effective, and maybe the defibrillating ring is a little less effective. But if you're not using the pill, it doesn't matter. And if you're going to use the ring, any protection that you can get is better than none. That's sort of my philosophy, right? It's like harm reduction.
Exactly.
And that's the same thing with the 4 versus 7 versus 2 doses of oral PrEP. More is better, and that was our strategy in HPTN 082, right? It was that we were saying 4 or more is fine. Great.
Really? From the beginning,
From the beginning, we were saying that. And we were getting tremendous pushback. Why are we saying that when the CDC guidance is not?
Right.
That's not consistent. And we've had
the demonstration conversations now show us this. Like we do not.
That's right. Okay. And you are seeing in these studies regardless of the adherence, you know, even if it's in the few doses a week, you are seeing much lower rates of HIV incidence than you would expect. And so there is something, right? There's something protective happening even at the lower levels.
Or people decide, as they should, that they take it around the time
Yes.
they need it.
That's right.
Everyone's doing that decision making, right? So, okay, well, thank you. We're both frustrated about that then, but this was a great talk. Thank you so much.
I know too, I think Waru, you have the question from Kate too, so I don't know if we want to circle back to that also as well.
Yeah, I think I shared a little bit in the chat, but
Okay.
About the sort of what the full HOPE scale is. So we use 6 items, and the longer scale is, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but I would definitely recommend looking at the full HOPE scale in your future prep studies. I'm also interested in sort of how you know, the relationship between HOPE and PrEP in other populations, right? So I have it, this was young women, this was also, you know, the study was in the earlier days of oral PrEP rollout compared to sort of now where there's more awareness, more availability. And so I wonder, if we start looking at different populations of adolescents and different relationships, like I think we might be able to more further understand sort of how HOPE, the role HOPE may play in adherence and persistence.
I think it's so interesting too to see the what you would consider to be sort of hard to understand, the distinction between high levels of HOPE in the face of high levels of depression, right? I mean, it's like what's going on there that I think we really need to think about.
Great.
Hi,
I think
Sarah.
we have
Yeah.
Sarah and then Kate have their hands up.
Hi, Sybil. Hi, everybody.
Hi, Sarah.
For a great talk. I wanted to just hear a little bit more, you know, at the end of your talk, you spoke about the really high adherence among adolescents in the CAB-LA trials, but also concluded with, you know, the important sort of truth that adherence is not just about a long-acting product, and there are so many social factors that play into ability and willingness to use the products. And I just wondered if there's anything that you learned in HPTN 08401 or 08301 about adolescents' experiences using these CAB-LA kind of in the face of the social environment.
Thanks, Sarah. So I will say that we did do qualitative interviews with both adolescents and parents, but we don't have that data yet. We're still combing through it. So I think we'll have a lot more information from those interviews. But also in the need for these implementation studies and other demonstration studies, you know, this is a very unique population, right? This is a population who was young, was at risk for HIV, but also had a parent who was willing to enroll them in a clinical trial of an injectable product. So, you know, I think that it's hard to generalize, you know, from that population, I think. And so those may have been some of the reasons why the adherence was so high, and why I really want to see how it plays out over time, because some of these young women were very young, you know, 12 and 13. How does that play out over time as they're, you know, continuing in these open label studies? How does their choice change if it does change? But then we really need to see in the broader population of adolescents without parental support, with higher levels of depression, you know, in challenging relationships and challenging housing situations, how does adherence really look, and do those visits get missed more frequently? And I would expect that they probably would. And so how are we going to address that?
Great. All right, Kate Koss, why don't you bring us home?
Great. Thanks, Sybil. That was so terrific and inspiring. I loved seeing the REACH results and all of the great work that you've done in counseling. And I'm just thinking about this expanding menu of prevention choices, which is so exciting. And what are some of the really key elements that we need to be thinking about for adolescents specifically, as there's that counseling about different products and then about continuation on those products? Or is it kind of really being open about, and flexible with those discussions. But are there things that you think we should all be keeping in mind in those conversations? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm always been a broken record about giving adolescents what they need, and what they need might change, and it might change frequently. But I really like that we're starting to see that choice is really an important piece that works for them. And again, not only choice of product, but choice of activity and choice of engagement and choice of adherence. And I know Sarah is planning to look into this more with some implementation work. I also I think we despite the REACH results, the first thing we're going to hear is, that's too much, it's too complicated. And in low and middle income settings, it may be, but we still have to advocate for investments in adolescents, right? I mean, in some countries, half the population is under the age of 18. So this is the group that we need to be addressing, and we have to be investing in young people and investing in giving them more. And I'm not saying it very well, and I'm maybe having a little bit of COVID fog still, but I just, giving them choice is one piece, but having the resources to back up those choices is really an important piece. And that's a political and an advocacy piece, but I think we can't shy away from showing what young people need and want, just because we're afraid that it won't be taken up. I don't know, that wasn't well worded, but that's how I feel about it.
Right?
Thank
It works
you.
for me. I realize that we're at the hour, a little bit beyond, but I want to thank both of our speakers for the time and data and energy and passion that they've shared with us today. And I hope I can offer that if people have follow-up questions or ideas or desires for mentorship or collaboration, they can reach out to both of you. So
Please.
I'm going to offer that on your behalf. But from us here at the CFAR and UCSF, thank you very much. It was great to have you.
Thank you. So good to see everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sybil. That
Bye.
was great. Thank you,
Right.
Lauren. That was great.